Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Red Haired Stokie. So, I think this is week 5. Yeah, I think this is week 5, and we were talking about Molly Lee last week, and this week on the Red Haired Stokie, we're talking about something that has always been a massive part of Staffordshire, but has had so many tragedies, and that is coal mining. Now, when we look back, coal mining is not necessarily the most interesting topic to talk about. But I think the most interesting thing about the coal mining in Staffordshire is the people, the social history. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, is some of the worst mining disasters in Staffordshire's history, the people and how it affected the area, the families, and the industry as a whole. The history of coal mining in Staffordshire spans several centuries, and it even goes back to Roman times. And it's always played a crucial role in shaping the county's economy, the communities. And when we talk about coal mining in Roman times, the Romans were very good at exploiting local resources, and the region's coal resources were exploited to meet local energy needs. So they came across, they found the clay, they found the coal, and basically started the pottery industry. However, it was during the Industrial Revolution that coal mining in Staffordshire really did take off. The Industrial Revolution and the expansion of the canal network in the late 18th century provided a significant boost to Staffordshire's coal mining industry. The county's rich coal deposits, particularly in the North Staffordshire coalfield, made it a prime location for mining. And the availability of coal-fueled, coal-fueled steam engines, that sort of thing, fueled the growth of industries such as iron and steel, potteries and textiles. And these were concentrated in towns such as Stoke-on-Trent, Wolverhampton, places like that. Now, during the 19th century, the demand for coal continued to increase, and that led to the establishment of numerous collieries throughout Staffordshire on an industrial level. And as this grew, the workforce in the mines expanded rapidly, and there was thousands upon thousands of men and boys, right down to little children, working underground in terribly hazardous conditions. And these miners, often referred to as pitmen, formed a significant part of the county's working class population. And what you tend to find is in Staffordshire, especially North Staffordshire, as a man or a boy, and quite a lot of women as well, you were usually working on the pots. But if you didn't work on the pots as a man or a boy, you went down the pits. There were pretty much your two choices. Now, the mining techniques used in Staffordshire evolved over time. Initially, the coal was extracted using quite primitive methods. So there was things like bowl pits, drift mines, where coal that was near the surface was accessed. And you find that a lot of these were on private land. So, if a farmer was digging and he found coal, he would start digging that coal up and open like a little bowl pit or something. And then as this easily accessible surface coal was sort of dwindling, they went deeper. They started following the seams down and using deeper and deeper mining methods, including sinking shafts, using steam-powered winding engines. And that started to be the norm. It was more common across Staffordshire. And then the introduction of more advanced mining machinery, such as coal cutting machines and ventilation systems, these all improved the efficiency and the safety in the mines, to a point. Now, the prosperity of Staffordshire's coal mining industry reached its peak in the early 20th century. And the industry faced quite a lot of different challenges, including, labour disputes, safety concerns, and there was 2 world wars. which caused havoc with pretty much every industry in England. And then the decline of the coal industry began in like the mid 20th century, and it was due to a combination of factors. So there was the discovery of alternate energy sources, changing economic conditions. We depleted most of the easily accessible coal seams, so it was costing more and more to get the coal out. And then, by the end of the 20th century, most of the Staffordshire's coal mines had closed, and it was the end of an era in the area. The closure of these mines had a really profound effect on the local communities, which had relied on these pits for employment, for their livelihood. And this led to unemployment, social upheaval. People had to move closer to where they could get work. And, the loss of that once thriving industry had been deeply intertwined with the region's identity, exactly the same as the pot banks. So when the pot banks closed, the potters didn't know what to do. When the mines closed, the miners didn't know what to do. It's something that generations of their family had done, and all of a sudden they had to go and work in a shop or, tarmac roads and things, and it was just a big change for them. But, the legacy of coal mining in Staffordshire is evident in our landscape. So there's abandoned mine shafts, there's spoil heaps all over Staffordshire, especially Stoke-on-Trent. And this is a reminder every day of our past industry. And people have preserved this heritage with mining museums and heritage sites. This offers insights into the lives and experience of miners. And a lot of these places are run voluntarily by people who used to mine or have family that mined. And, we've had to diversify as a county and go into other works. But I think it's important to remember the sacrifices and, just how dangerous this was. And although it's not an economic force anymore, the impact on our history and culture and communities is, unparalleled. And that's, I think it's a lasting legacy. It shows the resilience and the hard work of these miners that toiled underground. And I think it's important to acknowledge their contributions, because without these guys digging under the ground every single day, we wouldn't have steam engines. We wouldn't have had the Industrial Revolution. We wouldn't have any of the pot banks or pottery. Stoke-on-Trent, Staffordshire would have been a very, very different place if it wasn't for people digging up our coal seams. Steam trampers, steamships, things, big ships like the Titanic. They just couldn't have worked without the men under the ground, hand digging that coal out in those days. However, with its immense risks and unforgiving nature, there is a legacy of disasters that have claimed, countless lives, and this is what we're going to talk about today. So I think we're going to start with the worst disaster. And I will just note now that all of this will all be available on my blog. So you can head over to the Red Haired Stokie after this. And on the website, you can find all of these articles that I've written with pictures and things. You can re-listen to any of these shows as a podcast on all popular podcasting stations, so like Spotify, Apple, that sort of thing. And they're all available on YouTube as well. So do head over. If you do want to support me, you can got a website called Buy Me a Coffee. You can just subscribe to the blog. You can subscribe to my YouTube channel. Every little helps. If every little subscribe, every share, everything just helps me to continue recording and researching our history. Right, so we're going to start with the mini pit disaster in 1918. And this was a tragic accident that occurred on January the 12th, 1918 in Halmer End in Staffordshire. And it actually resulted in the loss of 155 men and boys, which actually makes it the deadliest mining disaster in the whole history of the North Staffordshire coalfield. The exact cause is unknown. It was an ignition of flammable gases, and no official investigation was able to establish the source, which is a recurring theme. I mean, I couldn't record every single disaster. We'd have been here all week. So that's why I've just stuck to the worst ones. But please, if you are interested in this, do go and do some research yourself and find out a little bit more. Read about them, read about the people that worked on the mines. Go to the local mining museums. You've got Chatham Whitfield, they have open days. We've got Apedale, and there's more. So to continue, right, the Mini Pit Colliery was actually named after Minnie Craig, who was the daughter of one of the owners, and it was established in 1881 in Homer End. Now, this pit was actually known for its profitability due to the fact that they were mining 5 thick seams of really high quality coal. And this colliery served as the downcast shaft for the Podmore Hall Colliery, which was part of a much larger industrial complex, including like an ironworks, a forge, and coking ovens. And the mining operation was actually accompanied by its own mineral railway as well. But despite its profitability, the Mini Pit Colliery had a history of danger because it had got fire damp. Now, fire damp was basically a mixture of extremely flammable gases. Before the 1918 disaster, there'd actually been 2 other explosions at the colliery, one in 1898 and one in 1915. And these had both caused a loss of pit ponies and I think 9 miners. However, these previous incidents had much lower death tolls because they both occurred on a Sunday when fewer workers were present. And the prevalence of fire damp also affected other collieries within the Podmore Hall Combine, leading to several explosions at the Burley Pit. Now, during World War I, coal mining played a vital role in supporting the country's needs, fueling ships, power stations, coke ovens, and the munitions industry. And many of the people that were actually working in the mines at the time were either too young, too old, or too disabled to enlist in the military. Now, this disaster struck on January the 12th, 1918, and there was a massive explosion that tore through the Bulhurst and Banbury seams of the mini pit. And within minutes, 155 workers succumbed to the effects of the explosion. And it was either the explosion, roof collapses, or poisonous gases that killed them. Within minutes, there was 155 deaths, and rescue efforts were immediately launched with teams from all across the North Staffordshire coalfield mobilised to search for survivors. But this wasn't without its own risks, and tragically, one member of the rescue team, Hugh Dorbar, actually lost his life during the operation, so the final death toll was 156. And among the victims, 44 out of the 155 were boys under the age of 16. Now, this explosion caused extensive damage to the underground workings, and the recovery took 18 months to remove all of the bodies from the pit. And an investigation conducted under the Coal Mines Act in 1911, but it never determined the exact cause of the initial flame. And the jury's verdict said it was just an explosion of gas and coal dust, and said that basically they need to remove the coal dust more to slow down the chance of future explosions. But no one was ever held responsible. But this disaster did have a big impact on the mining community, because many families relied on the colliery for their livelihoods, and a lot of people had just lost their main breadwinner, or the main owner in their family. And this did cause the pit to be closed. And during the Great Depression, this was during the war, remember, it plunged the whole area into like an economic hardship. And there was relief efforts. They were initiated by the Miners' Federation, and financial assistance was provided by various sources, including, I think it was compensation from a trust that the Podmore Company had set up. Now, years later, this is still the worst disaster that Staffordshire had ever seen in the coal mines. And in the 80s, there was a memorial erected by the National Coal Board to honour the victims. And it does serve as a lasting reminder. And everybody that died in the mini pit colliery from 1890 to 1931. Now, the next one we're going to talk about is the Talk of the Hill disaster in 1866. Now, the Talk of the Hill colliery was actually situated in the parish of Talk, and it was owned by the Staffordshire Coal and Iron Company, and it had two shafts, both the downcast and upcast shafts, and the initial workings reached a depth of 160 yards, and it was a 10-foot seam, so it was 10 foot high, and employed about 20 men. Now, the air intake in this area was assessed by Mr. Wynne, the inspector, in November, and 14 or 15 men were working there, and no complaints were raised by the workers to the inspector. And the longest stretch of the workings extended 500 yards from the shaft, with each section being ventilated by a furnace, pushing the air through. And then at 5 a.m. on Thursday, there was a loud explosion and flames rushed up the shaft, covering this whole surrounding area with soot. And apparently the shock was felt about half a mile away. Now, there was about 150 men working in the whole pit at the time, and the initial reports suggested that there was about 100 people that died. Onlookers gathered at the pit. They were all concerned, and these all actually hindered the rescue effort. So the colliery manager at the time, Mr. Johnson, cleared the pit bank, and the rescuers rode the cages down into the mine. Fortunately, there was 50 terrified boys brought back up the number 2 shaft, and several others were brought up the number 1 shaft, although they had suffered quite horrific burns. And these were all given a glass of brandy, which I think probably took the edge off the shock. And they were attended to, and there was a local Reverend Hutchinson from Torque, who provided comfort to the families while they were waiting for the rescue effort. Now, numerous teams of workers went into the pit, but what they encountered was actually a very damp atmosphere. And many of the men who'd been rescued from the new number 2 shaft, which were the first guys that came up, volunteered to go back down. And as they were, digging through the rubble and finding the people, the bodies that they were finding were actually dismembered, and many of them were lacking heads. 43 of the miners were dead and 13 were injured, and they were estimated that there was still 40 to 50 still trapped in the pit. And horrifically, the stables had caught fire during this, resulting in the deaths of 7 or 8 horses. And then when the bodies were brought back up, they were cleaned and identified by the families. And this is another one where they never found out what the cause of the explosion was. But it was probably one of 3 things, which is usually what they were. It was either firing shots, which is what they did to blast areas out, smoking, which sounds daft to us nowadays, but smoking was a common thing in the pits, or removing the top from a lamp to show the naked flame. The next one that we're going to talk about is the Sneed colliery disaster. Now, this occurred on the 1st of January in 1942. So this was New Year's Day. It was in Burslem in Stoke-on-Trent. And at 7:50, there was an underground explosion. And this occurred from sparks from the wagon. So it was either a wagon wheel turning or a wagon clinking into another one. And it actually ignited the coal dust that was on the floor. And this claimed the lives of 57 men and boys. Now, the Sneed area of Burslem had a long-standing history of coal mining since the 18th century. And records from 1896 indicate that Sneed number 2 and Sneed number 1 employed a total of 609 men and boys underground, with 124 working above ground. In 1900, the company was officially registered as Sneed Colliery, and by 1940, the mine employed over 2,000 workers. But they did face a period of idleness, basically, due to the discovery of an underground fire. Now, previous incidents of deaths in the mine had occurred, including a fire in 1904 that killed 3 workers. Now, this is even more tragic because traditionally, the miners wouldn't work on New Year's Day due to an old superstition. But because this was war, it was 1942, the men of Sneed reported for war as usual. There was a high demand on coal. Everybody was doing the bit, so they went to work. And at 7:50 a.m., an explosion erupted in the Banbury seam, which was about half a mile underground. And the blast was powerful enough to knock men off their feet. And Red Grocott, who was a 16-year-old apprentice, was blown around a corner, but was actually saved by a water drum, while his co-worker died after being thrown against a wall. Now, this explosion was confined to one coal face in the Banbury seam of the number 4 pit, where 61 men were working, and 4 of them did manage to escape alive. Now, other areas of the mine, luckily, were unaffected, but all the miners were evacuated, and the immediate aftermath saw the death of 55 workers, with 2 other guys that had been injured later succumbing to their injuries in the hospital. And news of this explosion quickly spread. This was a small area. Everyone knew each other. And anxious wives and relatives gathered at the pit head, awaiting updates of their loved ones. And on the first day of the rescue operations, there was 16 bodies recovered. But the presence of afterdamp forced a temporary halt to the rescue. At this point, they didn't really expect any further survivors. Now, the initial rescue team, which was the Sneed Mines Rescue Team, was soon joined by additional teams from other collieries across North Staffordshire. So there was people from Blackpool, Chatterley-Whitfield, Hamley Deep Pit and Shelton. And in the aftermath of this disaster, a fund was created and many people, including soldiers stationed as far away as Iceland, gave money. And the final death toll of 57 men and boys left 32 widows and 35 fatherless children. Additionally, the 24 unmarried men who died left behind 8 widowed mothers and 13 grieving parents. And it's easy to forget in this day and age that these families were probably left with absolutely nothing. So they were working these hours down the pit to bring what little money they could home to feed their families, their mothers, their children, their wives. And then all of a sudden, that little trickle of money that they had was gone. I mean, some people lost their husband and their son, and then they got no money at all, which is what the funds were set up for. Now, the inquiry, which was led by Sir Henry Walker, revealed that the derailment of tubs used to transport coal had damaged an electric cable, which led to sparks igniting the coal dust and caused the explosion. However, some historians have contested this and said that what actually caused it was a steel cable that had snapped. But there was another theory that tubs that were descending into the pit collided with a compressed air pipe, which caused a billow of dust and it was ignited by a spark. We're never going to know, and we're never going to know exactly what caused it, but they managed to narrow it down quite well. And because there was a connection underground between the Sneed Colliery and Woolstanton Colliery, what they actually did is they started bringing the coal up from Woolstanton instead of Sneed, which meant that the colliery at Sneed eventually closed down in the 60s. And in 2007, there was a memorial featuring a pit wheel, which you can still find in Burslem Town Centre, and it's got a plaque which lists all of the 57 victims. So if you're ever sitting in traffic in Burslem and you're wondering what the pit wheel is opposite the Queen's Theatre, that's what it is. The next one we're going to talk about is the Dig Lake Colliery disaster, which is also known as the Audley Colliery disaster. Now, this occurred on the 14th of January in 1895 at what was Audley Colliery in Bigland. And this wasn't an explosion. This was actually a flood, a devastating flood of water. And it rushed through the mine and resulted in the loss of 77 miners. And even worse, despite the rescue efforts, there was only actually 3 bodies recovered, and 73 of the miners are still there. They're still entombed in the mine. Now, Diglake Colliery was situated in the village of Bignell End in Staffordshire, and mining activities had been carried out intermittently from about 1733 up to 1854, when the mine was abandoned due to the lack of a canal or a railway connection, which meant that it was difficult to transport the coal and make a profit. And in the 1890s, a new mine, known as Audley Colliery, was established near to the old workings. And it had 3 shafts, so number 1, number 2, and number 3. And the 3rd shaft had previously been part of the Boyles Hall Colliery. Now, Audley Colliery was located on the former railway station, and the opening of the railway in 1870 made it much more economically viable, which is why they reopened it. And the precise separation distance between the new and the old mine workings was unknown because the records weren't complete. So they aimed for 80 yards. So what we're talking about here is the shaft. So in the old mine, the shafts had gone down, they'd gone along the seams, and then they'd sort of give up on that, moved across a bit, gone down again and along the seams. But the problem that they got is they didn't know exactly where the old pit was. So they gave an 80-yard separation, but discrepancies in scaling measurements meant it was actually a much narrower gap. And heavy rain and snow had overwhelmed the underground reservoir in the old Diglake Colliery, and the ground was just saturated. And it was between 11:30 and 12 on the 14th of January 1895, while there was about 250 miners underground, a massive wall of water just forcefully entered the mine. And they think it was the fireman, William Sproston, and ignited a shot in the new 10-foot seam in shaft 1. And what that had done is weakened the barrier, so the wall between the new and the old workings, and the old workings were flooded with water. So he basically blasted, and the wall had given way. And modern estimates suggest that the water barrier was subject to a pressure of about 100 pounds per square inch before it gave way. Now that is some force. And then the sudden influx of water, there was 77 men and boys that were drowned. One of the fireman's sons, who happened to be on an errand for his dad, was swept away by the waves, but managed to escape with other miners through a shaft that was connected to the disused Boyles Hall Colliery. Now, William Sproston and his other son lost their lives. And although, pumps were in the mine, they were installed, they were operational, and they evacuated the water at a rate of about 180 gallons per minute. But the water level only decreased by 6 inches. And then 4 days later, there was over 20 tons of water pouring into the mine every minute, which gives you an idea of just how much water there must have been under there. Now, upon hearing the water rush and sensing the rising levels, the under-manager, William Dodd, who got an office at the bottom of the number 2 shaft, swiftly alerted the other miners to the danger and participated in the rescue of approximately 35 to 40 individuals. And he also organised a search party and went back down into the mine to try and find survivors. Now, the next day, a roll call revealed that approximately 99 men were possibly still trapped in the mine. And a rescue team went as far as they could safely, but there was no sign of life or any bodies to recover. Now, 11 days after the disaster, the water level dropped by 4 foot 4 inches in the old rookery workings, which was actually where the water originally came from. However, the water continued to fill up the shafts at Diglake and Audley, revealing that the depth of all the old workings was less than anticipating, which was hindering the draining of the floodwater. So They just couldn't get the flood water out. As fast as they were pumping it out, it was pumping back in, and that was basically what they were fighting against. 6 months later, an inquiry concluded that no one could be blamed. The mine owners weren't to blame, but there was an emphasised need for better mine planning and accurate record keeping of previous workings. And Queen Victoria actually gave the Albert Medal to William Dodd for his bravery during the disaster. Now, today the official death toll stands at 77, although numbers like 78, 80 have been mentioned due to a duplication error on a memorial. There was a few funds that were set up to raise funds for the widows, the orphans, and the pit closed after this. The exact date isn't known. A 1924 map depicts the colliery as unused, and in 1932 and 1933, the bodies were discovered during coal mining operations at an adjacent mine, but 72 bodies are still down there, and it's sealed up now for safety, so it didn't affect other mines. And in 1979, the mine's precautions against inrushes regulations mandated a minimum distance of 121 foot between the shafts in a new coal or mine workings to prevent collapse or flooding. So what this actually did was protected miners later on down the road. But the biggest problem that we've got in Stoke-on-Trent and Staffordshire is that there's that many mines, that many pits that were dug without people knowing, on private land, that it was never able to be upheld properly. But luckily this was about the worst disaster that happened because of the old workings. And in 2013, there was actually plans for an open cast colliery, but it did raise concerns about uncovering the miners' remains. And the company were assured that they would not dig to that depth, but the application was denied. And on the 125th anniversary of the disaster in January 2020, a sculpture depicting two kneeling miners was unveiled in the cemetery of Audley Methodist Church. And the commemoration included a memorial walk and a minute's silence to honour the victims. Now, we've got another one to talk about, and this is the Mossfield colliery disaster in 1889. The Mossfield colliery was located on the outskirts of Longton, at the southeastern end of the North Staffordshire coalfield. The colliery had two shafts, both sunk to a depth of 440 yards, and it was just below the Coxhead seam where the explosion occurred. So this particular area was known as the 15S level, and the other seams above and below the Coxhead seam were also worked from the same shafts. Now, the colliery was located near Longton, and it was actually in the parish of Caverswall. And the two shafts that it had were situated 15 yards apart, each with a diameter of 10 foot 6 inches. And both of these shafts were used to bring coal up. So what had happened is one cage would go down while the other one was coming up. And each cage carried 4 tubs on 2 decks and operated on wire rope guides. It had 3 working seams, the hard mine, the Banbury and the Coxhead. And the hard mine seam was connected to the upcast shaft at a hooking on place mid-shaft, while the Banbury and Coxhead seams were reached through a stone drift, leaving the downcast shaft below the hardman seam. Now, the Coxhead seam was worked using a panel system. So there was levels driven on the strike of the seam, and the excavations were made between these levels, so it left like ribs of coal. And the Banbury seam was worked using the long wall system, where all of the coal was removed in one operation. And then tram roads were maintained on one or both sides of the drift, and the ventilation was provided by a waddle fan. Safety lamps were used in both seams, but naked lights were used to light the bottom of the downcast shaft. And the colliery officials included Mr. Blackwell as the managing director, Mr. James Potts was the manager, and William Barker and William Fletcher were the underlookers. However, Barker and Fletcher have not been officially appointed in writing, as was required by the Coal Mines Act. Now, the colliery operated in 2 shifts. So there was around 200 people working the day shift and 100 people during the night. And contractors and detailers worked separate shifts. Before the explosion, there were indications of a potential gob fire, and the colliery had dealt with gob fires over the years, but there had been ongoing problems and a lack of trust between Potts and Fletcher, with disagreements between them. And Potts had recently been injured in an accident and had not been able to visit the pit regularly. And when the gob fire was reported, it was believed that the proper arrangements were not made to handle it, and the stoppings were put in while the men were still working in the mine. And there was also issues with like ventilation, accumulation of gas, and supervision of the colliery. The explosion occurred around 10 to 4 in the morning, resulting in loss of life and significant damage to the shafts and the working. 13 men in the hard mine were safely evacuated, and assistance from neighbouring collieries arrived quickly to aid in the rescue recovery. The exploration of this mine later revealed damage to timber, blown doors, and multiple collapses. There were 64 men and 16 horses that lost their lives in that explosion, and there was extensive damage to the Banbury and Coxhead seams. The recovery operations lasted over 3 months, but there was 5 bodies that they just couldn't find, they couldn't recover. And the rescue was very limited due to gas and the multiple collapses in the Coxhead seam. Now, it's easy to sit here and think back and hear all these facts and figures, but we've got to remember that these were all people. These were all individual people with individual families, and they all lost their lives for coal. And if it wasn't for them losing their lives, if it wasn't for the coal, we wouldn't be where we are today. Coal mining's importance in Staffordshire it was such a vital energy source. It was a catalyst for industrial development. It was a driver of economic growth. It was a promoter of transport infrastructure, and it caused social transformation. And the legacy of coal mining in Staffordshire, it continues to this day to shape the region's history, heritage, and identity. And the coal mining disasters that occurred throughout Staffordshire's history have left a lasting imprint on the region. These tragedies are a stark reminder of how dangerous coal mining was and the sacrifices that these men who toiled underground made. The stories of loss and resilience are a testament to the dedication and the strength of these mining communities. These men didn't have to go back underground. These men risked their lives every single day for coal. It wasn't just, yes, they went down, it was a job, it was a wage, but can you imagine where we would be today if no one had gone down into these mines and dug for that coal? The world just would not be the same place. England would not be the same place, and Staffordshire certainly wouldn't. The Industrial Revolution, the canals were built to transport these things. And I think we forget, when we look at our history and heritage, we look at all the beautiful buildings and the old railways, the pottery industry, and we forget that actually all of it was built on the back of these men that went down for 12 hours a day more and physically dug out coal with their hands, losing friends, losing family. The risk, I don't think there's ever been a more dangerous job. Correct me if I'm wrong, But I don't think there's ever been a more dangerous job than coal mining. And I think we should remember them. And like I said, if you want to head over to my website after this, it's the Red Haired Stokie. I have written the article to go along with this, so if you want to go and have a read, you can do. You want to go and have a little research, look for the other coal mining disasters in Staffordshire, feel free. There's lists of names of the men and boys who were lost along the way. And I think it is important to remember them. I think it would be nice in Staffordshire to have just one big memorial for all of the men and boys who were lost in every coal mining incident in the history of coal mining in Staffordshire, right back from the beginning. But yeah, I think that's enough for today. So yeah, head over to the Red Haired Stokie if you want to support what I do. Just you can subscribe to my YouTube, follow me on Facebook. You can sign up for my newsletter on the website, and these episodes are available as a podcast on all popular podcast services. So yeah, I'm going to leave it there for today. But thank you very, very much for joining me. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you all learned something. And yeah, until next week, thank you very much for your time.